Hello, and welcome to the Resource Review Series from the CYFAR PDTA Center. I'm Stephanie Nunn, and I'm an Evaluation Specialist with the CYFAR Professional Development and Technical Assistance Center. In this series, you'll learn about useful resources that are available to you and hear from other CYFAR projects about the approaches they're taking to these topics. Today's topic is reliability and validity. We can start with a working definition of reliability and validity from our two resources. Fiona Middleton says, reliability and validity are concepts used to evaluate the quality of research. They indicate how well a method, technique, or test measures something. And from the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse, we have reliability and validity consider whether we are studying what we think we are studying and whether the measures we use are consistent. Reliability and validity measures are important for all sustainable community projects because of CYFAR's commitment to evaluation. Sustainable community projects want to identify measures that are well aligned with their program content and goals, and measurement's a key component of evaluation, and it helps CYFAR SEPs to refine their programs and report on their successes. The PDTA Center encourages programs to consider the reliability and validity of the measures they review or create before they adopt the measure. Here with me to talk more about reliability and validity are Dr. Adeya Richmond and Dr. Jaime Ballard, both from the University of Minnesota. Adeya and Jaime have their backgrounds in social science research and are experienced in survey design and considerations for CYFAR community projects. Thanks for joining me, Adeya and Jaime.
Thanks for having us. I'm looking forward to talking about reliability because reliability is a key part of a high quality measure. Another way to conceptualize reliability is the extent to which a measure produces consistent results using the same methods under the same circumstances. Why does reliability matter? It's because adequate reliability suggests that your measure will provide consistent results. And this is important that a survey will provide these consistent results each time it is administered, because interpretations and conclusions from participants' responses must be accurate, as a lot of our decisions are based on these responses. And then another area to consider is low levels of reliability. As we know that when there's low reliability, this indicates that items and questions on the measure are likely to produce inconsistent responses when the measure is given to the same person over time, for example, or when the measure is administered under untested conditions or circumstances. So choosing a reliable measure starts with answering a few questions, and Jaime will go into more detail about how to choose a measure later in our talk, but we wanted to throw out a few questions to get you thinking about it before we do our later display. So let's say you wanted to measure gardening knowledge. One thing to consider is your measure for children or adults. Will it be taken on a computer, tablet, or with paper and pencil? And will participants complete it on their own or through an interview by a staff member? So once you have identified which are your participants and how they will take the measure, it's important to consider two statistics that will help you decide which measure is best for your program. One is to identify the range of Cronbach alphas for a measure to ensure they are adequate, and each measure should report which their Cronbach alphas are. And the Cronbach alpha tests how closely related the items are as a group, so that you have a good idea of how well it's measuring whatever topic you'd like to measure. In our example was gardening knowledge. The other statistic is retest reliability, which is usually measured by a correlation statistic between the different administrations of the measure. And strong reliability indicates that the measure that you selected is consistently measuring the concept or the topic that you would like. We provided a table here with different values of reliability coefficients that correspond to how well the reliability for a particular measure might be. So we think everyone should have this close by when they're considering which measure to use for their program. So a couple of areas of warning when it comes to identifying measures that are not reliable. It's important to determine, because if a measure is not reliable, conclusions from participants' responses may be inaccurate. And this means that you may think that a measure is testing one thing and realize that it's not, based on low reliability. The second consideration for a measure that's not reliable is that decisions based on participants' responses may not be effective or relevant. A lot of programs will make decisions based on participants' responses for their measures that might have implications to funding or what programs are offered next. And it's important to have measures that give accurate and meaningful data.
All right, we'll switch to talking about validity. And validity is the extent to which a survey captures what it is intended to measure. Basically, do these questions focus on the things that we want to learn about? So on the left here is an example of a measure that is reliable. The responses are consistent, but it's not valid. It's not focused in the center where we want it to be. And on the right would be a measure that is reliable. The responses are consistent, and it's also valid. The focus is right where we want it to be. So let's talk about why this is important. Why do we need to know the validity of measures? If measures are not valid, programming can be misguided. I'll walk us through an example. So let's say again that we want to measure gardening knowledge, and we have a measure that we think measures gardening knowledge, and we give it to all of our kids. It turns out they have high scores, so we start out with really advanced content that'll draw from that high gardening knowledge. But if the measure is not valid, if we think we're measuring gardening knowledge, but actually we're measuring gardening interest, then our programming has been misguided. We've started out really advanced when the kids might have a lot of gardening interest, but not necessarily a lot of gardening knowledge. So that's the first example of what can happen. Our programming can be misguided. Another thing that can happen is our evaluation can be misguided. So if we do another example here, let's say we have a program on food technology and we see that the kids are learning a lot. They're gaining new knowledge about food technology. And we want to measure that improvement so that we can show funders and stakeholders how much our students are learning. If our measure isn't valid, maybe it asks a couple questions about food technology, but it's really about technology more broadly. It doesn't have the focus we want it to have. Then when we give them the survey, it's not going to show a change in knowledge because it's not measuring what we think that it's measuring. So once we know that it's important to choose a valid measure, how do we choose one? The first step is that it has to be reliable. So again, on the left, the responses are consistent and they're focused in the right area where we want them to be. On the right, we have an example of something that isn't reliable. We don't know what it's measuring. It isn't measuring anything consistently. So we can't say if it's valid or not because it's not measuring anything consistently. So first, we have to choose a reliable measure. Then next, there are 3 different types of validity that we can easily look at. And the first is face validity. Is there a logical relationship between the questions and what we're trying to measure? Basically, when I read these questions, does it seem like they are measuring what I'm hoping they will? And the second is content validity. Did experts review this measure to make sure nothing is missing? If we have a measure that measures some parts of what we want, but misses others, that can be really problematic.
So one example of this might be with program quality. If we have a measure that looks at the safety that our kids feel and the rules that the program has, those are parts of program quality. But if it doesn't ask anything about relationships with staff, then that measure is not valid. That's an important part of program quality that would be missing. So it's great to have experts review the measure and check for if everything is captured. And we can have people look at it both who are professional experts who have professional experience and also people with lived experience in that area. And then last would be criterion validity. Do the scores on this survey match other related surveys? Is another way to check if we're measuring what we think that we're measuring. So we'd like to walk you through an example of how you might find a measure and check if it's reliable and valid. And so we'll walk through that here. And let's say we're looking at STEM interest and STEM interest in high school students. So let's search for STEM interest attitudes survey students. So we're going to start with the area that we're interested in, and then a couple of different ways of saying a more narrow focus like interest and attitudes. Always good to have survey or measure, and something about who's going to be taking it. So here we'll say students. And let's see what comes up. We're using Google because everyone can access it. Of course, there are other options as well. So here we have STEM attitudes or student attitudes towards STEM from Stellar. And there's a couple of responses there, also called the STEM semantics survey. So that might be one to start with. And we also have the STEM surveys. That's coming up a couple times too. So let's look at these two. I'll pull up their documentation separately here. And when we first look at the overview for a measure, it'll usually tell us what it's about, maybe who can take it, and then something about the validity and reliability that we want to learn more about. So this measure, the STEM semantics survey, looks like it's looking at those 4 areas of STEM, and it can be middle school through post-secondary. So it's going to capture the age ranges that we're looking for. Let's take a look at the instrument itself. So we can just do a quick check of face validity. Looks like it's asking about science, math, engineering, and technology, those important areas. It has a few different ways of asking about students' interest towards STEM. So it looks pretty good here at the beginning. I might check also if it seems like the language is going to be appropriate for students I'm working with. But I don't see any major red flags right now. Then let's look at the reliability and validity. So I'm pulling up what it says is the documentation. And it looks like this is the article about its development. So let's start with the abstract. I don't like to read more than I have to. All right, so it says it has excellent reliability, that it has good validity. So they're saying the right things. This is great. They list the reliabilities here. Adeya, is that the kind of thing we should be looking for?
Absolutely, that fits.
Perfect. Then I want to know some about who this was used with. Is that going to match the students that we're working with? So I'm going to search for subjects or participants, and that'll tell me who this was first tested with. So students in Vermont and Hawaii, I'm going to skip down. Majority of this sample were white, not a lot of racial or ethnic diversity, and about 10% of students qualified for free and reduced lunch. That isn't going to be a good match for the students that we work with, where most are on free or reduced lunch. I'd have some reservations. It might work, but some reservations. So let's take a look at the other one. Here's the STEM survey, and has 2 different age ranges for the form. That's useful. And let's see, they have a lot more information to sort through, but it looks like it also asks about those 4 areas of STEM, also has a 21st century learning. That's fun. And if we look at how they developed it, it was tested with 9,000 students. That's a strong start. And it also says they had high reliability and that it was reviewed by experts. That's great. And that they were looking at different ways that students interpreted the question. So that's great. They gave it to students and had them talk through their responses, so we know they're understanding it the way we think that they should be understanding it. All right, let's not quite look at those yet. Let's look just at the measure. So here we go. And all right, it's asking about each of those areas of STEM that are important. It looks like it's capturing different aspects of students' attitudes towards it, their interest and their confidence in it. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. And there's that 21st century learning part. So I think this is a good start, and we can jump into the reliability and validity. All right, they have a much more detailed description here than that other survey did. Looks like they've been through several phases, and let's jump through for the things that are most important for us. Okay, so it was reviewed based on expert feedback and participant feedback. They looked at the ways that students understood it. That's great for our validity. And here's the reliabilities. Adeya?
Let's look a little bit better.
Perfect. So the last thing I want to check is who it was tested with. If you've got 9,000 students, it's likely it captures some folks that are similar to what we're looking for. They don't say here, so we can always go back to that original article and take a look. So maybe we can do that quickly here, kind of quick. Great. So you might have access to the full articles at your institutions. For this, we're just going to look at the abstract of things everybody would have access to. And it doesn't look like it says exactly who it was used with, but it does say they looked at differences across grade levels, across races and ethnicities, and across genders. So we know they're paying attention to it being interpreted the same way across these different groups. So that seems like a strong start, and this might be a good measure for us to use in our program. Any other thoughts, Adeya?
No, I think those highlight the main key aspects that you want to review before you jump into a measure.
Excellent.
I think it's useful to think about the different terms folks might use. Like, it might not say reliability and validity up front. It might be a psychometric document, or it might be documentation and study. Lots of different ways that people categorize where that information is going on their website or in their download.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So one note about modifications. Once we've found that measure that has good reliability and validity, those qualities are only going to apply when the measure is used in similar conditions to those in the original study. So if you change anything about the measure or anything about the setting, that can affect the reliability and validity. So if we try to change the wording of items, or we switch the order around, or we drop some of the items, then it might not have that same reliability that it originally had. And the same if we change the audience. If we take something that was meant for teenagers and we try to use it with 5th graders, then it might not be as consistent for those 5th graders as it was for the age group that it was designed for. So as Stephanie said at the beginning, it's always best to use a measure in the setting that it was designed, to pick a measure that has documented reliability and validity, and then to use it under similar circumstances. If for some reason you can't do that, if there isn't a measure that matches your needs, or you're under big time constraints or something like that, and you're going to make those changes, do it with caution, and ideally then check on the reliability and validity yourself after you've used it in that different setting.
It's also important to indicate that you've made those changes. I think a lot of times time constraint is one of the biggest reasons that people will drop items or change it in some way, and being able to make sure that that's communicated is important.
Absolutely. So we have one resource we wanted to share on how to find a valid and reliable measure. It basically walks through those same steps that we just did in that example. So starting with, if you're going to do a Google search, here's some ideas of terms that you can search for. And then if you aren't going to do a Google search, here's some examples of repositories of measures that you can use that capture a lot of social emotional learning outcomes or other positive youth development outcomes. And then how to look for those components of validity and reliability that we've talked about today. We hope that that example and this resource might be helpful to you as you look for those measures.
Thank you, Adeya and Jaime, again for joining us and talking about these important considerations. The handout Jaime just mentioned will be posted on our website, CYFAR.org, and you can also find out about the other two resources we have as companions to this presentation. And so these are two curated, high-quality resources about reliability and validity, and they come from Fiona Middleton and the Writing Across the Curriculum Clearinghouse. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. And so the first is called Reliability versus Validity. What's the difference? And this resource tells us some basic definitions of reliability and validity, including many types of each of those. So test-retest reliability, face validity, etc. It talks about how to assess reliability and validity on your own to ensure the measure has been properly vetted. And it talks about the importance of selecting appropriate measures and maintaining the reliability and validity of established measures. And as Jaime mentioned in that study from STEM, North Carolina, you can see that collecting data from a lot of participants is necessary, and there's a deep amount of work that goes into establishing reliability and validity. And so to the extent that you can maintain that, you can make sure that that hard work was done and continued forward as you move the measure. So how can you use this particular resource? It can be a refresher on reliability and validity definitions. So if you have some staff who are working with you on your project, who might be helping you in your search for a new measure or survey, you can give this to them as a little refresher or a primer on those topics. If you're going to collect data in order to maintain a measure's reliability and validity, it'll walk you through those particular steps. Or if you need to consider what the data would be that you would need to reestablish reliability and validity for a new or adapted measure. So in that example Jaime gave, if you can really only find surveys for high schoolers and you're working with preschoolers or young elementary students, that can be something that's useful for you. And so that other resource that I mentioned is just titled Reliability and Validity. It's a little bit of an older resource, but I will say that these topics are pretty consistent.
They're timeless.
Timeless. Psychometrics are timeless. And so a lot of the information here is still useful, even though it is 27 years old at this point. So what does this resource tell us? It has some detailed descriptions of some of the most common types of reliability and validity. It has some common challenges to achieving reliability and validity. So if you're curious about what might be some obstacles you would face in getting reliability and validity established, it walks you through those. And then they have a really extensive annotated bibliography of scholarly work for further reading. So if that's something of interest to you, if reliability and validity is one of your passions and you'd like to read more, that's part of this resource. And so you can review some useful examples of each type of reliability and validity, consider common pitfalls others in academia have faced when it comes to reliability and validity. And as I mentioned, there are those sources for further reading about reliability and validity in particular. So thank you again for listening. Here are the links to those two resources. You can also find them on our website, CYFAR.org, along with the handout we created and this presentation itself.